All right, hi everyone. My name is Asimina Kiourti. I'm an associate professor at The Ohio State University, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. So the topic is going to be mentoring graduate students and postdocs towards independent careers in CPS. So we heard about a lot of projects these past 2 days, and the secret component behind all of these projects is actually our students and postdocs. All of us are working with students and postdocs. We're trying to manage them the best way we can. But there you go, and you have challenges coming up, and sometimes you don't even have the training to address those. So the panel has 2 components. One is mentoring, and that means day-to-day basis of mentoring students, making sure they're successful in what they do. And the other component is their future and how they themselves will eventually have an independent career in the field of cyber-physical systems. So the way we're going to run this panel is that I'm going to present some scenarios of students and postdocs that are relatively challenging. Some of us may have come across similar scenarios. Personally, in fact, when I kind of started digging into the scenarios, I picked a couple that I have encountered myself. These scenarios don't necessarily have a solution, so we're not here to find a solution to those scenarios. It's more of a discussion on how we could potentially address these challenges when we face them, and what we could do in the future to avoid ideally such scenarios. So we have 5 amazing panelists here. Thanks so much, everyone, for accepting the invitation. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to emphasize that this panel is interactive. They're not going to have dedicated presentations or anything. I'm just going to show the scenarios, and we'll have an informal discussion about how they would handle it. So we're very much welcoming suggestions and thoughts and questions from the audience at any point throughout the panel. So let's go ahead. We have Dr. Fatemeh Afghah from Clemson University. We'll have Dr. Necmiye Ozay from the University of Michigan. Then I'm going to go with alphabetical order. So we'll have Punit Prakash from Kansas State. We'll have Sriram Sankaranarayanan from UC Boulder, and Kyriakos Vamvoudakis from Georgia Tech. So before we get started, I'll just go, we can go from starting with you, Fatemeh, all the way down. Briefly, if you can introduce yourselves. We've seen a lot of you on panels and talks and so on, but doesn't hurt to do that once again. Just a brief introduction of who you are, your research field, and maybe your experience with students.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatemeh Afghah. I'm from Clemson University Electrical Engineering Department, and I was at Northern Arizona University before I came here. So my research is related to using autonomous drones in disaster management, and also AI in communication, and designing communication systems that they can serve better the autonomous vehicles and autonomous drones.
Perfect. Necmiye.
Hi, I am Necmiye Ozay from University of Michigan, Electrical and Computer Engineering. I work on formal methods and control for hybrid systems and cyber-physical systems. That's it for now.
All right, yeah. Thank you, Sriram.
Hi, my name is Sriram Sankaranarayanan. I am a professor at University of Colorado at Boulder. I work on formal methods for CPS. In terms of mentoring, I have mentored about a small number, like 12 PhD students and about 4 postdocs. And I've also been mentored by some of them. So,
thank you. Kyriakos.
Hello, I'm Kyriakos Vamvoudakis. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in the Department of Aerospace Engineering. I work on learning-based control and security of cyber-physical systems. And through the years, I have supervised about 11 PhD students, 20 master students, and probably like 30 undergraduate students. And it's not only mentoring them, but also getting mentored, as Sriram said. So,
Thank you. And Punit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Punit Prakash. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Kansas State University. My research is in the field of technologies for minimally invasive image-guided medical interventions. And my group over the years has consisted of PhD students and postdocs.
Perfect. Well, so let's get started. So I'm going to show the first case study. I'm going to read it, and then we can talk about that. All right. So I'm reading it out for everyone. So Dr. Klein is excited about the grant proposal she's writing to NIH. The proposal builds upon research she has been conducting as a postdoc in Dr. Janko's lab. When Dr. Klein meets with Dr. Janko to discuss the grant proposal, she's surprised to discover that Dr. Janko is less than enthusiastic. Dr. Janko informed her that the proposal is too closely aligned with her current work and its future direction. She says that the proposal needs to be reworked and focus on a different, more independent direction of research. Dr. Klein leaves the meeting frustrated, disappointed, and unsure how to proceed. So this is a scenario we have. And I'm going to start with a question of what are like the themes that you see here? What are the issues that you're seeing? And feel free, whoever wants to take the lead. We have a lot of questions. So.
I'll get started. I think as an associate chair of my department for the last 8 years, this is number one kind of conflict. I often see who owns the work that they do in a lab. Is the ownership the person who did the actual work in this case, which I assume it is, or does the ownership belong to the PI who maybe brought in the funding, maybe set up the overall infrastructure, maybe even contributed ideas, right? So this is typically the way it breaks down, and each circumstance is different, but really it's a really difficult conflict to manage, but it happens all the time.
So maybe I can chime in a little bit. I think part of it is not communicating expectations early on. And I can try to give examples from how I approach my relations with postdocs. And I haven't talked about mentoring, but I will put Young on spot. So Young was a former postdoc, now he's a CPS PI. So typically if a postdoc comes into your group, they are bringing a totally new skill set because they are coming from a different group. And I try to respect that skill set, and the postdoc position is most successful if they can combine that skill set with the skill set in your group. And typically in those cases, the postdoc owns the research, and we communicate this. When Young was a postdoc with me, we wrote a proposal together, bringing together our own skills. And it started with that, and he took off, and he's doing great things. So I think part of it is communication, part of it is respecting the skills of the other person. That's kind of how I see it.
Anyone else would chime in? Yep.
Yeah, and one of the things that sometimes help for formalizing or giving some structure to that is putting together an individualized development plan. So the IDP is almost required at several institutions for doing sort of training programs for postdoctoral researchers, and maybe that's one of the things that could be included in there in terms of what are the expectations for where the research will go in a year or two when the postdoc moves on to their new position. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a static document. I imagine that sort of thing evolves as the research progresses.
So I agree with all of these comments. Maybe one other aspect that I can add is when I started my career, one of the first comments that I got from the mentors was try to establish yourself and try to differentiate your research from what you have done during your PhD and what your advisor research is. So I think we all like our postdoc to continue their career in academia, which is like now, it's very competitive. The industry market is really good, and most of them they're going toward the industry. So we like to help them to build up that independent career, and having that communication and having that mentoring plan is going to be very important, and also like giving them some room to build up that research. But we also want to communicate this to them that if you're going to be successful in the academic market, you also think you need to think about the new aspects and the new skills that you have and how you can combine it with the research that you do and bring something new to the table, so you can have like career proposal in the future or K1 proposals from NIH.
Yep. And Kyriakos, yeah.
Yeah, so it's always...
Yeah. Let me just, because just to go through the panel for this question, and then I'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword because, we always encourage our students to do independent research, and in order to submit proposals, they also have to have preliminary work. So this preliminary work will be somehow the work they have done, either with a PhD or the postdoc advisor. So, and of course, they have to build on that. So, of course, there has to be some dependency. It cannot be completely independent. So, but of course, I mean, it's a tricky situation. But I think preliminary work is always good and can be the foundation.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, comments or questions from the audience?
It's a fantastic question because, I think the problem that is alluded to perhaps is worse in the life sciences than it is in engineering. On the other hand, I do think that NSF requests us to fill out what are called the postdoc mentoring plans. And I think it's a very important part of postdoc mentoring plans to not treat postdocs as cogs in your greater research scheme. And I think the heart of this story is a perception that Dr. Klein felt she was a cog in Dr. Yanko's plans. And perhaps it had been fostered by the financial incentives. And in the life sciences, there's sometimes 3 postdocs before they get a faculty position. And, so there's issues about those power relations. But I do think that we the people, we the investigators, I think we need to start paying more attention to those postdoc mentoring plans. Because part of postdoc mentoring needs to be to mentor them to become independent researchers and thereby to write proposals building, and a lot of you said this, but I really think that this is not, it's less hypothetical than it appears, and it's a very common problem, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Maybe I can add to that. So my very first NSF proposal was actually research I did with Georgios Finakos, but it actually came out of George Papas. His group was the one that started the research. And I remember writing to George and saying, hey, George, would you like to be on this grant? And he actually declined. He said, when a PhD student or a postdoc does work in my lab, they take it with them. And I very distinctly remember, and I was very impressed by that, right? And I think it's part of a culture, right? So because George had that culture and he had that expectation, that's the expectation I have of my PhD students. So when they do research in my group and they wish to go somewhere and continue that research, it's obviously something that obviously belongs to them as their intellectual effort, as their product of their 5 years or 4 years or however long, right? So I think it's a cultural expectation as well that we establish in our community, and it comes from what our mentors did for us is what we do for our people who follow after us.
Yeah, great point. So we heard a lot about what should be done to avoid these situations. Sriram, you mentioned you are dealing with such situations on a regular basis. So kind of the hard question here, if a scenario like this does happen, what should the mentor do? What should the mentee do? So what would be the plan of action now that they reached to this point? Again, there's no right answer or wrong, I'm sure, but your thoughts?
I think everything that was said here, right? So having set guidelines, having expectations laid out is very, very important, right? So all of this happens because people don't communicate expectations. So if there is an expectation, for example, I don't think the mentor is completely always at fault in a situation like this. It could be that the mentor is a junior faculty who just started out, and this could be like, and it's usually unusual for people like that to have postdocs, but it's not unknown. And in fact, many of the conflict situations happen with relatively junior faculty, and it's understandable because it somehow becomes more of a zero-sum game at that point. And I think it could be, for example, this could be like not They could be co-PIs on the NIH grant. Let's say they are just a few years apart, right? And somehow one person happens to be a junior faculty and the other person happens to be their postdoc. It's happened, but they could be co-PIs, for example, right? It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Anytime it gets to an administrator, I mean, I'm a junior administrator, but still administrator like me who's outside, and I have to piece apart like, you on the 27th of September did this, and it gets to be messy. No one likes to deal with it, right? So talking it over, having lots of conversations, establishing each person's point of view, I think usually is helpful here. Anytime it gets out of hand is when like really messy situation starts, right?
Yeah. So any last comments, thoughts from anyone regarding this case scenario before we move on? Either panelists or the audience. Okay, I don't see anything, so let's move on to scenario 2. And that's about graduate students now. Aligning expectations. We talked about expectations for postdocs. This is regarding graduate students. So I'm going to read the story. A third-year graduate student in my group is adept at performing experiments and analyzing data, but is a very slow writer. Last fall, I set multiple deadlines that the student missed. To avoid delays in publications, I have taken the lead in writing manuscripts based on her work. However, to graduate with a PhD, I realized that she must write the next manuscripts herself. Setting deadlines has not worked. Communicating the importance of manuscripts to the scientific endeavor has not worked. Encouragement hasn't worked. Other than being patient, what should I do? So this is, again, a challenging situation. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, or we can find a solution here, but it happens. Not to this extent, but I have dealt with such situations myself. So again, the question to our panelists, what kind of themes do you see here? And your thoughts on how it can be prevented, or if we reach to this point, what can we do?
So I will chime in. Many of us laughed because probably we have been in this situation. But I will point out something. The underlying reason could be that it's not the student is just a slow writer. Maybe there's a mental health issue. And in most of the institutions, we have these support systems to help students. And I think it is good to point the student to these other support systems so that if it's really a mental health related issue, they can get the help that they need. And that's essentially my experience is most of the problems with time management, not being able to deliver. There is another underlying issue, and if that issue is resolved, then everyone is happy. And
yeah, and I agree so much with that. I remember when I started, when they asked me what is like one thing you wish you knew when you started, like back in 2016 as a faculty member, I wish I knew that I should like talk to other people to get help. As a faculty member, like a situation like this comes up, like you said, it could be a mental health issue, I don't have the training, guide the student to appropriate resources. So I think it's very important to not handle these situations ourselves, but find people who know, who have the training to address those. Other thoughts from our panel?
Maybe I can add one more case to this. So as you said, it depends on the reason. Sometimes not that the students is slow, maybe because I work with a lot of international students. And maybe they don't have the skills for writing a technical paper in English when they start their PhD or master's position. So I have done cases that I read in the first paper for the students, and they have done like the technical work and the simulations, and then we start like a step-by-step process of practicing different aspects of like technical writing, how to communicate your ideas. So we move from I do most of the writing for you for the first paper to like on the second year or third year, they are at the level that their papers are much more mature. So I guess like that happens a lot with the international students, and that's a part of the process that they need to learn in your graduate study.
Yeah, good point. Yes, Sriram.
So we study hybrid systems here. So students are in automata. So you can't put your student in mode not writing and then switch the mode to write everything. I think following up on what you said, it doesn't work that way, right? And I do think writing is a process where students have to learn step by step by writing more and more of the manuscript until they become adept at writing. The other thing I noticed, and it's a big mea culpa from myself, right? Students are so focused, and my students do this too, so focused on running experiments, writing code, they forget that writing takes time. And what happens here is I have written so many papers that I get really good at writing them very fast. And so then the students become like dependent on me to then do the writing for them. They write the experiment section, they fill in the table, and that's a lot of work. Each line in the table sometimes, like once Shoradeep said, each experimental line in one of his papers was like written in blood, right? It's like very difficult. But at the same time, you know, if the student is just focused on that, then how do they learn how to write, right? So it's very difficult, but I think it has to be done in stages, just like you mentioned.
And I'm smiling because this morning I received an email from, they're undergrads, not graduate students, but have been doing research with me for the past 2 years. They wrote their first journal paper, and they say, Professor, here's our paper. We just didn't put in the abstract introduction. So I replied back, I gave them some guidance on how to go about it, but they purposely avoided the entire introduction section. Yep.
Yeah, another issue is that although they have done the experiments and they have all these things, they're not excited about writing a paper because they're like, maybe sometimes, oh, I don't like the project, I think I want to involve in the project that the other students get involved, why you involve this student, can involve me, and then, so there's always something that we need to handle in this situation in an elegant way. But yeah, excitement also is a thing that they're not excited enough to write a paper, although they have done all the experiments.
Punit, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting scenario, and it gets at a somewhat complex issue because sometimes, for example, there's some students who are keen to pursue an academic pathway, and they're well attuned to the fact that a really important part of research, in addition to doing the work, is communicating it, sharing it with your peers via presentations and literature and so on. But there's a good number of students who want to go to industry, and they might be technically very excellent, go to other career pathways, whatever they may be. And the question comes up, well, why do I need to write? Well, that's sort of the foundational part of research is communicating your work. So there's some aspect to that. But, and then there are challenges sometimes with group expectations and institutional expectations. And so it can be a fairly sort of complex issue. So I'm glad you brought it up in terms of, you know, potentially mismatch in expectations and what that may be. And I don't have any answers, but I think it's pretty complex. Yeah.
Maybe I can add something. You talked about expectations, and I think there is the community expectation. In computer science, we have made conferences, especially these highly selective conferences, into a very high-pressure game, right? So as a professor, I am under pressure to produce papers, but those papers have to be, like if you send a paper to ICML, Univ, or ICCPS, right, there is no tolerance for, like, I've seen reviewers where the first time they read like a slightly less formed sentence, you know, the paper's kind of getting down, right? So there is this pressure to be perfect whenever you submit a paper, and then students get upset or very nervous around touching papers, like, what if I ruin a perfect paper? Like, you know, what if I introduce a typo? And what if the reviewer calls us out on it, right? And I sometimes find that pressure difficult to handle because, you know, we are all under deadline pressure, like trying to send these papers out.
Right. Any thoughts from the audience? Yeah, please. Okay, yeah, let's start here, and yeah, please go ahead. Is there a mic? Oh, yeah, there's one here and one there that you can go to.
So from my own experience, I think we have to be patient sometimes because the writing skill, technical writing skill is different from them just speaking, even if somebody speaks English as a first language, right? That's one part. And secondly, whether their motivation is lacking or not. So sometimes maybe they're doing experiments because their advisor asked them to do, they're running experiments, they're not enjoying it. So there are multiple components could be there. So we have to find the root cause. Are they really motivated to publish? Are they really excited about what they're doing? I'm just saying one part of this, looking at the student's point of view, right? And the third thing that I've seen also, peer mentoring helps. For example, in my lab, every week we have a group meeting. No matter what they do individually, they listen to each other. Whenever there's somebody publishes, I said, okay, let's congratulate this student because he has got a paper accepted in somewhere, right? Or sometimes I say, oh, he got NSF student travel grant to travel to Brazil for GlobeCom. Let's say. I'm just giving you an example. So that is an inspiration for them. They say, oh, if you work hard, the other people will support your trip to somewhere else. So it all depends on, and some students, of course, may have a language problem. Like, for example, they're not good writers, right? They think they do good research, solid technical research, but they're not good writers. So there are multiple reasons. So I think this should be case-by-case basis that you have to handle exactly what the situation is, right? At every university, there are technical writing courses. I send my students where I spot that some students has difficulty in writing, take this technical writing course, because it doesn't, in a PhD program, 4, 5, 6 years, having one semester technical writing course can actually alleviate many of these problems. Because there'll be people, instructors, they'll correct their grammar, they'll correct their way of writing. So all sorts of helps actually are there in many places. Graduate offices, most often, they'll read their thesis and all these things. So I think we have to ask for multiple level of help, but as an advisor or PI, I think we have to be a little patient because junior students, they take longer time to produce something which is more mature, like ICML, Univ type of thing, and then others. So we create the pipeline and slowly encourage them so that they do not get disappointed and leave the program or get fed up with what they're working. They have to enjoy what they do.
Okay, thank you. There was one more comment. If you can please go to the microphone.
Yeah, one piece of advice I got was get them writing something small. So sometimes we go for the big paper, and that's sometimes so overwhelming to kind of get it. Might start with a poster. The poster has forced you to put your thoughts a little bit, write a short abstract. It's not as high pressure, and you start, and then you go to, I mean, in our field, the journal paper is the thing, so you go maybe to a conference paper, and then now you've added a little bit more detail, and then by the time you go to the big one, it doesn't feel as daunting, and I think that's a very good way of kind of staging it for people who are a little bit daunted by the big jump from 0 to 100.
Okay. Yes.
Just to add to everything that everyone has said, I think it's important to try to establish a culture of writing in the lab. And when I was an assistant professor, I did a lot of things. I did a lot of experimentation to figure out, well, first of all my students came in and they were told that they had to write 3 first author journal papers to get PhDs. And that was set from the very beginning. I've also did things where I tried to set up a time where the whole lab sits down and writes, like reserve an hour in a conference room, because some of us faculty have taken like the faculty success program and writing 15 minutes a day. Like we get taught that stuff, so I was trying to pass that on to my students. That didn't work all the time, like sitting down and writing together, but I think setting that expectation, I mean, I've never actually experienced this, so maybe for people who are new, set the expectation that this lab we have to write, especially if you're pre-tenure. Students will not be autonomous. They need to understand they have to help you, like you have to help them help you, especially pre-tenure. And so I would just say experiment. I know George Whitesides, he has a whole paper on writing papers. He's in, I think, chemical engineering something. I have a colleague that uses his method. It's like outlines. Like as soon as you start thinking of an idea, you start writing. So you guys could look that up, the George Whitesides method in writing papers. So those are just some thoughts I'll add to this.
Thank you. And in fact, this was a question I wanted to ask. So thanks for introducing the concept of setting expectations here. So in the first case study, we talked about setting expectations for postdocs. And that is, I think, a bit more streamlined to have those postdoc mentoring plans. Some of us do have like those career development plans when a postdoc joins our lab. But how about the graduate students? So we heard an idea about setting expectations, for example, like number of papers or joining some like weekly kind of seminars where all of them get to write. How do you go about setting expectations for graduate students? If that's even possible. Like in my case, it varies a lot, but your thoughts?
I'll tell you what my postgraduate student once told me. So long time ago, I don't want, I mean, his name is Aditya Zuchi. He's kind of in the industry today doing research, but he once was like walking with me, and we were having this conversation about like what he should be doing and like how he should be setting expectations. And then he kept asking me like, why don't you pressure me? Why don't you put more pressure on me? And then essentially eventually I told him like, there's one thing I can do, which is I can give you technical advice, I can tell you what to do, I can work closely with you, right? But the one thing I can't do is give you motivation, right? You have to be pre-motivated to be successful. And I think for most PhD students, that's the only expectation, right? Try to do whatever you would like to do to be successful in your own goals. Why did you set out for a PhD, right? You probably set out having something in mind, and I would like to see them achieve that, right? And everything else flows from that. If that's being a faculty member somewhere, then that requires a different set of expectations. If that means like joining an industry group that does cutting edge stuff, then that requires a different expectation. But I always think that expectations kind of flow from what the PhD students want to achieve, and that's the usual successful route. When I have to foist my expectations on them, it never seems to work out. There's an impedance mismatch, and they end up leaving my group usually.
So maybe I can try next. I agree with you. I think it mostly depends on what the students want. One of the first conversations that I have with the students, even before they join my lab during the interview, is what career path you want to take. So if somebody wants to go to industry, it depends, R&D, software work, hardware work, if you want to have your startup, if you are thinking about academia. So I don't think like the expectation is like setting the number of like papers that you need to have or where you're supposed to have those papers out. Is more like what you want to do your career, and the training and mentorship and even like the research flavor should be dependent on what they like to do in the future. Because I think one of the most important products in our job is actually the students, not necessarily like the papers that we publish or like the grants that we get. So I'll try to adjust it on what the students like to do. And one thing that I also agree with you is pressure doesn't necessarily work. So if you put the pressure maybe, or if we try to like impose the way that the area that we are interested in, or like our way of thinking about a certain projects, we are killing the innovation. So I'll try to give them a space to bring what their innovative aspects are. Maybe they can find something about the project that they haven't think about, and that's not going to happen with deadlines. They need to digest the project, think about it, sit on it for a while, and it's going to happen eventually.
Yep.
So yeah, I agree with oh, yeah.
No, I think it was on.
It was on, right?
Yeah, it's
so
on.
I think I agree with the aforementioned speakers. So the expectations are not set early, but they're adapted every time. But they're adapted also based on the project that the student is working. So, so of course, if the student is hired, for example, to work on an applied project, of course, the expectations will be different. If the student is hired to work on a basic research topic, then of course the expectation will be different. So, and during the interview phase or whatever, I mean, you say that what the project outcomes have to be. So I guess this is somehow the expectations, but we usually don't give the numbers. So we don't say, okay, you have to graduate with 20 journals and 50 conference papers. So yeah, but it's adaptive. It depends on the project, I think, mostly, and it depends on the student capabilities and the student background.
Yeah, one thing to add on my end. Yeah, just one comment on my end. The concept of culture in the lab that we talked about earlier, I think applies in this case as well. So having like group meetings where people get to see, like incoming students get to see what others are doing in their second, third, fourth, fifth year of PhD. Having that culture in the group also helps kind of indirectly set expectations, not verbally, but see what makes someone in the group successful. Yeah, please go ahead.
So this is something I've learned over the years. I never used to do it, but my department used to have a form, like recently introduced a form like 4 or 5 years ago. And that form basically lays down a written contract between an advisor and a student. When that form came out, usually I, like all things new, I stare at it and I go, paperwork, right? Who wants to fill out paperwork? So, but I've recently embraced that form because I feel like the act of writing things down and signing them puts a level of formality on it, right? So when I talk about expectations, being individual dependent, that is correct, but the communication of those expectations has to be arrived at, I think, and be updated and constantly stay afresh, because I think miscommunicating expectations has led to a lot of angst about, the student thinking, oh, the professor expects me to work on a weekend. There are like micro expectations there, which I think is very useful to say, like, I don't expect you to work on the weekend. I do expect you to like take responsibility and finish things that you have done. So the other thing is like emails, like how quickly should I respond to your email? Even things like meetings, like, I have a long commute and I'm often late, so I expect my students to give me that grace to say, I'm late, I'm sorry. Right? But then I return the same grace to them. If they are late, then we forgive each other, right? So I think there are lots of things it's better to put it down on paper, then things work out much better than to have miscommunicated or uncommunicated expectations.
Yep. Thank you. So any last thoughts here on this topic? Yes.
So let me start by saying I have a lot of trouble with this. So I've tried some things that have kind of worked sometimes and not other times, and I thought I'd just share some of those. And one of them is, I think, especially if you work in a theoretical area where a lot of your papers are sort of theorem-proof type of papers, students a lot of times, at least with me, when they've struggled to write their first paper, every single time it was because they were not reading enough papers. I think, if you want a student to be comfortable knowing what's involved, they need to be very comfortable with not just your papers, your 4 or 5 papers that their research is based off of, but they need to be reading more than one a week that is just from the general literature. And it should be at the point when they set out to write their first paper by themselves, they should be very familiar with the expectations of the journals and these kinds of things. I think a lot of times they're just not. I know in my case I have been somewhat lax in the past about really finding ways to push them to read more. So that's one thing. Another thing that's happened is I've noticed that some of my students are very overwhelmed by having to write papers. It's an IEEE TAC paper is 16 pages long, and it's very dense, and it takes months and months to write. So sometimes what I've done is broken it down into very, very, very small pieces. So I'll write out an outline with them, a very detailed outline, and then I will meet with them for 15 minutes once a day. And the idea is that they're supposed to write maybe a paragraph a day, maybe. And then we go over that and we kind of pick it apart. And the reason why that's worked is that I've found that a lot of times the student that I did this with particularly was the type of student where I would give them advice on how to improve their writing or something, and they would make that one change to that one place in their paper where I gave them that advice, and then they'd never use that advice ever again. So it was actually more efficient for me to meet with them 15 minutes a day, we go over the paragraphs as they came out, rather than try to do things all at once. But it meant setting up those meetings much more frequently. But I think it really kept the student from being overwhelmed by the enormous, the enormity of having to write their first big paper. So I think that was a nice transition between kind of helping me out on a paper and starting to write their own. It seemed to work in that case.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so let's move on to the third case here, and this is a mentee's perspective. So let me read it, and then we can comment on that. So Ben is beginning his second year as a postdoctoral research scholar. Though he has enjoyed working on his mentor's research project, he's becoming anxious that he has not yet started an independent project. When he joined the lab, he had hopes of pursuing his own independent interests. Every time Ben tries to bring up his concerns with his mentor, it seems like the mentor can never find the time. Ben is reluctant to make a misstep, yet he knows the clock is ticking. So we did talk about postdocs and setting expectations well in advance. Here's a slightly different case where the postdoc is trying to do what he's supposed to do. The advisor doesn't seem to be willing to support or can never find the time. And now the mentee's perspective is, what do I do? How do I handle that? So it's kind of seeing a similar problem from a different perspective. So your thoughts?
So it's a really interesting scenario, and they could be, lots of good or not so good reasons why, for example, a mentee, whether that's a student or a postdoc, is unable to get the attention or the time needed to put in from their advisor to get feedback on their project and so on. At the PhD student level, there may be some avenues where the student could get some sort of guidance, and that's the committee, for example. The advisory committee might be one way to get some input, but also to nudge the mentor to, maybe you want to spend a bit more time with the student. And, figuring out some way to emulate that at the postdoctoral level, I think, is important, because we all have sort of different personalities, and, I'm sure we've all come across some folks where the postdocs will say, no, we're going to meet now, and we're going to do this, and others might be a little bit shy to sort of, take the misstep, as indicated in the slide over there. And so, one thing that may be helpful for postdocs, but also for faculty taking on a postdoc, is to indicate that there are other folks who can give input, and that community extends of, you don't have a committee, a supervisory committee or an advisory committee at the postdoc level, but, here are a couple of people you can contact for help that, I might get busy as a mentor, but, I'm not intentionally sort of not giving you attention. So just to provide some outlet, and that those other folks do not necessarily need to be within the institution. A lot of us are working on projects that have external collaborators, be they an industry or other academic institution or other places. And so sort of creating that environment where folks feel comfortable to be able to reach out and, essentially present their views and seek input from different directions, I think is important.
Yeah, thank you.
So, let's see, I think there's also another thing here that if you're doing a postdoc, so I think it's like a double job, right? You have to work for your postdoc advisor, but also you have to work for yourself. So I think, and every day has 24 hours, so you just don't sleep. I'm just kidding. But, when I was a postdoc, I was doing two things. I was working for my postdoc advisor, what he wanted, and I was also doing my own papers, and I wrote something, a lot of papers and all these things. So I think there's always time, and I don't think there is a need for a communication, because for a clear communication, because when you're doing your postdoc, it's an official agreement that, of course, you have to be independent, right? And you have to do some other things as well, because you have to build your career. And I think this also goes back to number one. I think that we said that when you're submitting a proposal and then you are dealt out far from what you have done in the past, and it's like, no, yes, this is mine, this is not yours, and so on. But if you're also doing some other things, then you can eventually start preliminary work and eventually write a successful proposal, then build your career on a new topic. And
yeah.
Maybe I can add a little bit to this. So a postdoc is someone who has already a PhD, so they should have some independence. And also when I was doing my postdoc, the first thing, even like when we were talking with my postdoc advisor before I started, he said, 50% of your time, there's this project, you contribute to the project. 50% of your time, it's your time to whatever that interests you. One thing I find quite useful, and a postdoc can also propose this, as a postdoc, you also want to learn mentoring. And one thing I try to facilitate in my group is I ask my senior PhD students and postdocs to write small research projects that I can sort of pair them up with undergrads and master's students, because there are lots of master's students and undergrads who are very much willing to do research. And I personally have a limited bandwidth. And if there's a postdoc who wants to initiate something, that's a very good mechanism. And I am always willing to be this person who is pairing up. So that's one thing I think postdocs can do. If they have independent ideas, even they can like come up with a small project idea and say, oh, I want to work with a master's student, or I want to work with an undergrad on this project idea. So that might be a way to initiate these type of independent projects, and they will also get help from the student that they are working with for their preliminary results that they can build on later. So it's just a way for postdocs to start this side projects.
Yeah, Sriram.
So let me bring a different perspective to this. So it says that the mentor can never find the time to meet with a postdoc. And that brings up a different conversation on bandwidth. Just how many students, how many postdocs can a person afford to mentor? And the answer is different for different people, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot, because it changes over time, and it's something that as a PI, as a professor, one needs to be very aware of. Like for me, I would say 3 PhD students at this point in time, and 1 postdoc is my absolute limit, right? And that kind of is a hard call to make, but once, I find myself like running out of time to have conversations about something as important as how do you start your independent research career. Like if you don't have the time to have those conversations, right, then it's a situation where you have to really ask yourself, like, do you really have the bandwidth to take on this postdoc, or is it something like, are you overextended? Is it something where maybe you bring in your junior colleague and say, can you mentor this person for me? So we talked about recruiting externals, right? So it's something I think every PI needs to be very aware of, because we get funding for these things, and the expectation is we take care of our students, postdocs, but if we can't, maybe it's important to recognize that we can't, and then have someone else step into that role as well.
Yeah. It's one thing to add on my end. Both you and Punit talked about these kind of cases of unhealthy relationships. So it's understood that the postdoc should be independent, but there are cases where unfortunately the relationship is unhealthy due to the PI. One additional kind of aspect that comes to my mind is the difficulty of being an international postdoc or student, where a lot of them feel they don't have any other options. They're kind of stuck with that PI. So I think like a US student can say, I quit, I'll go find a job, for example. An international person cannot do that. So yeah, I really like the idea of having like a committee. It's not just you and your PI. There are other people you can talk to. So that's great. Fatemeh, do you want to chime in? Or?
I think if the postdoc makes it to the second year, it's a very good thing for an advisor if they haven't joined the industry yet. So definitely they need to have the room to build up their independent research. Having the committee is very helpful. They're at the stage that they need to participate in proposal writing, getting the experience, learning the language for different agencies, and learning how to build up their own independent proposal. So that's definitely the duty for the advisor, to put in the time, help them to build up that network, participate in different groups, and
Perfect. All right, so let's head to the audience. Any thoughts that anyone would like to share? Okay, I don't see anything. All right, so let's move on, and we have 12 minutes, so probably our last case scenario, and that's back to graduate students. And the topic here is assessing understanding. So let me, again, read it through, and we can comment on it. So you have just spent the last month working intensively with your new graduate mentee. You have given her multiple papers to read and have had several discussions about your research. In addition, she has engaged in several different aspects of an ongoing project over the last month. She's hardworking, seems to understand the research your group does, and things seem to be going well. On Monday morning, she hands you a draft of the introduction section for a possible project. After reading through the draft, you are forced to conclude that she does not understand the work your lab does at all. So, and here kind of the main topic is how do you establish understanding where your students stand. This is the case of a scenario of like a new student who came in, but it could be, I guess, at any point, how do you assess where they stand? So, thoughts?
Maybe I can say something quick. It might again depend on the area, but I don't expect a first month student to understand stuff. I am usually like, your first year you are learning, you are taking courses. I don't give them multiple papers. I maybe give them one paper. If this semester we can understand this paper together, that's great. I think that there's an over expectation.
Yeah,
they are
perfect.
coming in to get educated, to get trained, and courses are part of the training. For me, the first 2 semesters is their opportunity to take courses, build up their background so that they can understand stuff. In that sense, I don't think people should understand multiple papers in the first month. I usually expect them to understand one paper really deeply in one semester, and I think that's an achievement, at least in the type of things that I am doing.
So actually this has happened to me, and I was happy because, so I heard the structures as a student. I'm a controls, okay, so it's kind of related. And then I just saw something unique in the student, although it was in a completely different field. And she didn't know almost like 20% of controls. And then eventually she became the best in controls. She passed the quals, #1, she did everything perfect. And I was like, you see, we have to take the risk. It doesn't matter if they know in the first week what they're doing in our lab. They can always learn, and they can always bring new perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think this ties back to the writing as well. This is why I have learned that writing is so important. When you could have tons of discussions with students, and as professor, I catch myself monologuing all the time. In fact, I'm doing that right now. But monologuing is what we do a lot, right? And often I have to check myself and say, does the student really understand? I just went on for 20 minutes. Like often, the student, like I see this blank look on their faces, and I know that I'm not connecting to them, right? And I think this kind of check back in terms of like write something, explain something in your own words, come back to me. I think it's a very valuable check back. And I completely agree that this is completely unreasonable to ask students to do this. But if you do this, I think this is exactly the way to check back. Make them write a paragraph or 2 or even a page and see what they have understood.
How often would you set such like checkpoints with students?
I mean, this is not something I have done with writing, but I usually, like for a few students, I've asked them to come up with PowerPoint slides, mostly for different reasons, because I've had like communication difficulties with English. So I've usually asked them to, come back with PowerPoint slides and walk me through those PowerPoint slides. So that works very well, right? Then there is a lot of clarity in how much of what I said they understood. And so then I started writing out my own thoughts, because I felt like if I just monologue for 30 minutes, that student wasn't catching everything I said. They were missing a lot of it, and they were too shy to stop me. And in some cultures, you don't stop the professor, right? So then I found that it's much easier for me to write and for them to write as well, like put PowerPoint slide. So I don't do it to all my students. Some of my students are like, I feel like they get bolder and bolder all the time, which is perfect. Like they just stop me and say, what you just said makes no sense to me, right? And that's perfect. But if the student's unable to say that, then I think this is the next best route. Like just have them do PowerPoint slides, like a few slides every meeting, then we know. Did they understand what I told them? Are they understanding their role, their work, everything?
Yeah, thanks. Any other comments from the panel? Yep.
So I think one of the comments from the audience earlier was, using group meeting, for example, as a way for different students or members of the group to learn what others are doing. But just along the lines of the last comments, one of the exercises we do sometimes is if a concept is not coming across very clearly, we'll ask, the person who's presenting a particular concept, to explain what they're doing. And then the rest of the group will take a few minutes to say, okay, this is what we got from your explanation. And hopefully everyone's on the same track, in which case that was, it's likely the person understood the concept well, but also did a great job communicating it. But if there's quite a bit of discrepancy in terms of the message folks got, that sort of, is an indicator. So, oh, maybe I'm either not explaining something well, or I don't understand it quite well. And so it's a totally natural, I think, thing to come up, that everyone sort of moves across with different concepts at different paces. And if we get time to work on things, then the opportunity for improvement is always there. But figuring out how to personalize that and what is reasonable for a given person in a given topic at a given point of time in their life and so on is always dynamic. And just ways to sort of present that feedback, to recognize the issue in writing and presenting, maybe one way to do that.
Yeah, I agree with what was said. I think one of the practices I do with my students is just like after our regular individual, like one-by-one meetings, write a summary of what we discussed. It doesn't have to be like something formal. Maybe just have some bullet items of what new aspects of the project, what we discussed, what tasks that we define. It doesn't have to have a deadline, but we just want to be on the same page of what happened in our meeting, so we make sure that we have the right understanding, but at the same time not putting the pressure on them about the technical writing. And about the technical writing, I think one other thing that helped with my student was having them to review the papers. So they read a lot of papers, of course, but they focus on the code or the technical aspect. But having them in a position of a reviewer for a conference or a journal, it helps them to criticize the writing and understand that what are the weak aspects that they have in their own writings, or how they need to better communicate in their papers and become a more professional writer. That at least helped me a lot in learning how to write better proposals. I learned from the panels or the proposals that I review. I think that helps my students also with technical.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Maybe if I can add something quick. I also, one thing I try to do is not understanding is normal. And I sometimes sit with my students, try to read the paper, and I ask all sorts of random questions because I am not understanding what's going on there. And I try to show them what type of questions I ask when reading a paper. And them seeing that I am the professor, I am not understanding everything, I am questioning, I am trying to figure out. Seeing me going through that, I think they also learn how to understand better. So, so that's maybe one other thing.
Perfect. All right, so back to our audience. Any thoughts that you guys want to share here? Questions? Yes, if you can go to the microphone. Thank you.
So this is a problem. I'm not very sure. It's related to this, but I'm not very sure how to solve. So one of the things we have at the University of Michigan I've learned is it's really hard after maybe your first or second year to let go of a student. And that troubles me because, again, yes, there's a role for mentorship, and but even with your best efforts, you can, I guess you can say that some students might not be cut out for a PhD, right? If we can't accept that, then that means we're saying everyone that we hire, we are very sure they're cut out for a PhD. I don't think that's true. And so I sometimes feel like you want to fail fast because of that, because I hate when you have a student got to their fourth year, they've put in all this stuff, then you start kind of feeling this sense of sunken cost, and you don't want to let go of them even when you know that they are not PhD material. So again, it's somewhat related to that sometimes I don't want to take that risk anymore because I know that there's no path outside of that. I think it's problematic, of course, because people will sometimes mature to this place. So I'm asking a question, really. I'm sorry, I'm not giving a solution. I'm really asking a question. How do we handle this issue of sunken cost and trying to make sure that you don't bog someone down for a long time just to realize something that maybe you were seeing the signs early, and you just kept on kind of pushing until a point where it got very difficult to sever the ties.
Yeah, good question. I don't know if anyone wants to share thoughts here. Yeah.
I have done this. As a graduate chair, I talked to a 6th-year PhD student who really failed out of 3 advisors, and it's a big failure of a graduate program as a whole. It's a conversation I swore never ever to have again, right? And I think one thing that we then started instituting was reviews. We call them, like in some universities they're called Black Fridays, but typically, you know, at Stanford it was called Black Friday. But typically these reviews don't say much about PhD students who are doing well, and you get everything is good. But typically catching students who have this habit of shifting between multiple advisors, who have not met some programmatic milestones like qualifying exam, comprehensive exams, right, at the right times. So we think of a PhD as an open-ended thing, but we do have to think more of it as like a 5-year degree in ideal conditions, right? And I really sympathize with this idea of failing fast if someone is not cut out. It's sad, but it happens. And B, I think I have learned through bitter experience that qualifying exams need to have teeth. You cannot just pass everyone. If there are concerns at the 2nd year, qualifying exams are really the place to address them and say, look, let's look at what you've done, let's look at how you've done it, let's see if this is the right path, or else here is a master's degree, go take it. We are engineers, we have skills, industry wants us, right? We could do that. But I feel that's a very important, very rarely discussed point. No one's comfortable talking about it, but we do need to say that.
Okay. So our clock says we have 0 seconds left. So we're in 1 hour sharp. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks to the audience, and thank you so much for participating. We appreciate it.